You know, I think the first question just is, you talk a lot about Asheville and why that's such an important story for understanding how places are valued all across America. Just talk a little bit about Asheville and why it's important and central to your story.
Well, what's interesting about Asheville is, you know, cities are all kind of all the same wherever you go, but Asheville experienced such a tremendous crash. And a lot of communities experience crashes in different ways. Everybody's got the story of expanding their infrastructure, building a mall, and your downtown dies. Then there's this kind of, how do you fix it? And some of it's zoning problems, development and market problems. But a lot of communities have had this death and rebirth cycle. In the case of Asheville, the extremes of the low lows and now this kind of tremendous ascendancy into value and popularity, it just makes for a good case study to show people a story they're very familiar with, but giving them an extreme example. Mm-hmm. So it's hard for people to see their own community that way. It helps when you have something more abstractly that tells the exact same story they're going through.
And what was that story?
Of how Asheville died? Well, in the 1920s, when the train lines came in, we experienced growth at 20% in population growth every year throughout the decade. So if you can imagine, train lines at the Vanderbilt estate brought down from New York City. So that brought a flood of folks with second home market, vacation, tourism, people coming out of the polluted northeastern cities for clean mountain air, and with it a lot of speculation. There was a lot of development that happened. And the city, in an effort to try to deal with that, started building massive amounts of infrastructure. If they look forward, we're going 20% per year throughout the decade. You know, the sky was the limit through the 30s, right? No one saw the crash coming. So they did the responsible thing and bonded out for parks, sewer projects, road projects, transit lines, trolley lines, and basically kind of fixing the city that had grown up in a chaotic way and trying to pay for it. Because of that, we became we had the highest debt per capita of the entire country. When the Depression hit and our books were audited, we thought we had $5 million in the bank. It turned out we had $18,000 in the bank. Oh. The entire city council was indicted, and the mayor committed suicide. We also did something really weird. In the 1930s, part of the New Deal program, the federal government said, you know, a lot of these communities that took out debt, we're going to absolve you of your debt. We're going to remove that. And because it was a pretty heavy burden. And if you think about what happened in this last recession with the federal government stepping in and doing the stimulus packages, that was modeled after the New Deal. Now, what did we just experience in this last 20 years? There were a lot of places that said, we don't need your federal money for your rapid transit or whatever. And they shunned the government. What's interesting about Asheville doing that, we did the same thing. So we're kind of like the proto-Tea Party in a way. We paid off that debt and it took us from 1930 to 1976. But because of that, we locked our city in time. So we went from being the second largest city in North Carolina to being I think we're now the 15th or so. But it's all kind of interesting that we got locked in time that way. We couldn't, it really drove the city broke for about 50 years to pay off all that debt.
So switching gears a little bit, a lot of your research focuses on, if I could be so general about it, the numbers, the math, and looking at the numbers differently. Talk about how you perform your analysis and why is it important to look at the numbers differently from a communication standpoint? Well,
for us, I mean, the firm that I work with is called Public Interest Projects, which is kind of a misnomer. It's really a for-profit real estate development company. Part of what we do is communicate to our citizens why it makes sense for us to do development in the downtown and why does it matter in the first place. In Asheville, it's a very vocal crowd. The leadership is very grassroots. So every decision is this really huge public controversy, no matter what we're doing. So in that argument, you get folks on the extreme right and folks on the extreme left. So on the extreme right, they assume that downtowns are subsidized and that they're evil, and the world needs to be suburban because that's what the market wants. They don't understand that it's actually subsidized, so we explain that to them. On the left, people that assume that all developers are evil and that all development is bad, and somehow they neglect that they live in houses that somebody built. But putting that aside, we have to explain environmentally and economically why it makes sense to do downtown development. But downtown is just a microcosm of what the city is. And the city is a microcosm of what the county is. So if you think about us as a real estate developer that has 6 or so acres in the downtown, We are a shareholder in that downtown. We are an investor in the downtown. We produce, $40,000 a year in taxes to the city and $60,000 a year in taxes to the county. So those are our contributions into those corporate environments for the public services. So we're thinking that way about downtown. Well, the politicians should be thinking the same way. They're the board of directors for the corporation called the City of Asheville. The county commissioners are the board of directors for the corporation called Buncombe County. So those two corporate environments are essentially really, really large real estate developments. You've got costs that go into it. We track all of our costs of our light bulbs, how much it costs to heat and cool our buildings, in addition to our tax cost that pays for goods and services. Now, if government were to think the same way, that and they generally do, it's just getting them to put two and two together. What's the cost of maintaining this corporation, and what's my revenue? So what are the taxes that are coming out of that land in order to service it? And so we try to just make it clear for the politicians that, or the community leaders, and it's not just necessarily politicians, it could be people on boards and organizations at the Downtown Association and things like that. Just get them to understand the value effect of going down this road. So that's why we run the numbers. We think that it eliminates a lot of the emotional aspects to it. One of my friends who's a transportation engineer likes to joke that everybody with a driver's license feels that they're a transportation engineer. If you think about it, everybody that's in a city is a shareholder in that corporation of the city, and they should be thinking that way. Yet we don't. We tend to think the way that we live, and we keep on failing to see that there's a lot of other people in this corporation that have needs and a stake in it as well.
So you talk about running the numbers, and what we observe you doing is running the numbers in a different way, and you use this great analogy about the car and miles per tank versus miles per gallon, and then how that translates into tax revenue per acre versus tax revenue per site.
Yeah. Talk
a little bit about how that methodology works.
Basically, what happens, oftentimes when we discuss buildings or development, people will say, there was even today, this afternoon or this morning, there was a gentleman who talked about the tax production of his 500-acre development. Now, 500 acres is larger than my entire central business district by double in Asheville. And he's only paying $120,000 in taxes. To the county, my downtown is producing in Asheville $3.4 million a year in taxes. It was kind of interesting because from his perspective, $140,000 is a lot of money, which is true. But at what cost for all of that? So when you look at, let's take a Walmart, for example, and I use the example of Asheville's Walmart. Our Walmart's worth $20 million in totality, so its tax bill is about $250,000 per year in taxes, which is huge. But it took 34 acres to get there. My house, where my wife and I live, we live on 1/10 of an acre. We pay $2,000 in taxes. So how do you put my house against Walmart? Well, a $200,000 property is no match for a $20 million property if you look at it that way.
Of course.
But if you took 10 of my houses in my neighborhood, that's an acre. That's $20,000 an acre. If you take that same acre area and go out to the Walmart and chop in and pull out, you say, well, what's its per acre production? It's $6,500. So if you're running a city, what would you rather have? $20,000 of production or $6,000? Now, if you go downtown in Asheville to one of our buildings that we rehabbed, it's producing $634,000 an acre in taxes. So just that's the simple numbers. It's the efficiency level, or let's say in a car, the miles per gallon is what you rank a car on. That gallon is a finite commodity. I have yet to find an acre of land that's cheaper than a gallon of gas in any community that I've studied. So if we're doing this for a $3 to $4 commodity, why aren't we doing it for a $30,000 to $40,000 commodity? And again, going back to what a city is, it's just a bubble of land. You can't make more land. You can annex more. But in the case of a county, that's it. You don't see counties annexing land because they bump up against another county. So how counties use that land is actually more important than how cities use that land.
It's Will Rogers' famous quote, "Buy land, they ain't making it anymore."
Exactly, yeah.
One last question for you. You've done a lot of these analyses in the West, Montana, Colorado, Wyoming, and Idaho. I just wonder if you could talk about some of the lessons you've learned or trends you've seen as you've studied these places throughout the Rockies.
It's been great working with the Sonoran Institute on this. It's funny, I actually joked about it this morning, that my East Coast bias in coming out here and what I thought the Rockies were. And then I come out here and see you all actually have some spectacular little towns that give you the genome of how to grow, so it's all here. Just walking out the door here into Bozeman's incredible. So that's been one of the interesting points. And also just in running the numbers, it's showing the same stuff that we're seeing on the East Coast. They're generally different in the different states that we've operated in. So in the case of Idaho and Wyoming, it's a little kind of mystical, like where the retail tax go, and that's been kind of interesting, the opacity in trying to get the tax dollars. Colorado was much more upfront about running the tax information. Their policies are a little bit more clear. Montana is interesting in the fact that there's no retail taxes whatsoever. So it's, in my mind, it's absolute lunacy to do any kind of single-use retail establishment. And if you think about it, they're just really big, cheap boxes. So right out the door, you're paying a really low tax rate because it's a cheap steel box. The assessor goes out there and goes, what's the value of this thing? It's a cheap, dumb box. So that's what it gets set at. So, a typical big box store is about $50 a square foot, wherein your house is probably $200 a square foot. So just on a per unit basis, you're paying 4 times the value or 4 times the taxes that a retail establishment is. Now, in the states that have retail taxes, you can at least make up some of that gap in that retail tax that comes back to the community. But in Montana's case, you don't have that. So it's basically just wasting your land. You still have to put the streets by it. You still have to run the police officers by it. The garbage trucks still go by it. So all of that infrastructure is being laid into the ground, and the revenue isn't covering its cost adjacent to it. So that was kind of a little bit. I think Montana was the first state we analyzed with no retail taxation. But all of this is on the About Town report. So if you want to get into that.
Sounds good. Thanks for joining us. Any last thoughts?
Well, I mean, these are always great analysis projects that you all do. I wish there were more Sonoran Institutes across the country. It's really kind of amazing to just cut through the noise and just say, here's the math. These are numbers, and they are what they are. And I wish more groups were handling this kind of conversation with that level of maturity.
Great. We do too.